You know, this is hard to describe. Psychologically, as I said, I had seen dead bodies, I'd seen dead soldiers. Nothing could prepare us for what we saw at Dachau. My name is Arthur Stern. I was born January 17th, 1922, which makes me 92 years old this year. I was born in Bayonne, New Jersey. My parents came from what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were born in 1885. My father came to this country in 1912 at the beginning of World War I, and he could not send for my mother immediately because of the war, and she did not get here till 1920 with two small children, my older brothers. And I was born 2 years later in 1922. My father was in the real estate business, and at that time they were comfortably well off. Unfortunately, in 1927, the bank started to call in their loans. He had a number of properties, and he lost them because he had borrowed on them. At any rate, times were tough through the Depression years. After finishing high school, I got a job in New York. I went to New York City, got a job in a record shop. And I lived at the YMHA at 92nd and Lexington. And my salary in those days was a royal $21 a week. And what was wonderful about it, this was the period right before the beginning of our entrance into World War II. And the USO was very active. It gave out tickets to servicemen for Broadway shows. And if the soldiers and sailors had not picked up any tickets, we were welcome to get them. We'd make a mad dash for the subway and get to the theater just in time for the overture or the first act. And we were able to see a number of wonderful Broadway shows in that period. It was a great year for me. When I got back to Middletown, it wasn't long after that the war had started, and I tried to enlist in what was then the Army Air Force. It was a peculiar situation. Eventually, I wanted to get into what they call the Air Transport Command. Things did not work out. I got my draft notice in October of 1942. The draft board insisted that I be drafted. I was turned down for the other. I was in Company E of the 232nd Regiment, 42nd Division, 7th Army. I remember kissing my mother goodbye and telling her I'd see her in a few days. And 3 days later, after I went in, I was on a troop train from Camp Upton, New York, destined for New Orleans. The normal course of events would have had me coming back home after basic training. That was not to be. I didn't see my mother for a year and my parents for a year and a half. I was shipped down to Guantanamo Bay and eventually to Panama. There were 3 troop ships. 2 of the troop ships went to the Pacific. I was fortunate. My troop ship embarked at Panama, and I did my basic training in Panama. I was there a year and a half. I hated the tropical climate, but that's another story. And I did mostly clerical work. I was a good typist. I was a teletypist. I also worked on an Army mine planner which planted mines outside the breakwater of the Panama Canal. Every time the ship went out beyond the breakwater, I got deadly sick. I was the company clerk. I didn't have to do work on board. I didn't have to do any of the manual work, so I would head down to my bunk and lay there praying and hoping we'd get back soon. After a year and a half in Panama, the Army decided that all these troops were not needed down in Panama. There wasn't the same urgency to protect the Panama Canal, but the urgency was in Europe and Pacific. They needed soldiers in both places. So I was sent back to the States, and on June 6, 1944, I was on a Navy transport in the Caribbean when the announcement was made that D-Day had occurred. Our troops had invaded Normandy in Europe. I did my basic training all over again at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, and here the emphasis was on combat training. We were shipped out to Europe on December of 1944. We landed in Marseille. It was bitterly cold, and we were taken to a staging area, which was an elevated plateau a few miles outside of Marseille. And then from there, we were sent by truck to northern France, to Strasbourg. And that's where our combat operations began. I was very fortunate. The captain of my company had thought that I would be his bodyguard and messenger. And he asked me to turn in my carbine weapon for an M1. And I demurred. I said, "Captain, I did a lot better on the firing line with a carbine, which was a light weapon, than I did with the M1. At any rate, he didn't like the sound of that, so he transferred me to regimental headquarters to be a guard, and he assigned the company bugler to be his bodyguard. And ironically, 2 days later, his bodyguard stepped on a landmine. He was immediately killed, and the captain's legs were blown. And that ended his service. He survived, I understand, but ironically, that could have been me. I had a few near escapes. On another occasion, this was not long afterwards, we had been in Strasbourg, and we were back a few miles, and the reason we had pulled out was that the Germans were pushing, so it was a sort of a no man's land. At any rate, on one day I was on guard duty, 4 hours and 4 off, and we were still very close to Strasbourg, and my knowledge of German was limited, but I could speak some German. But it was easy for me to learn German because I knew Yiddish, and a lot of the vocabulary is the same with a little different accent, a little different pronunciation. At any rate, I used to trade cigarettes, chocolate candy bars in a local bakery for cakes. So some of my friends there asked me to go into Strasbourg to that bakery and bring back some cake for them. And I thought that the people in the bakery looked at me kind of oddly, but I figured, well, what the heck? I didn't know why they were staring at me so. But I made the exchange. I came out of the bakery with the cake and my rifle slung over my shoulder, and I walked down to the nearest corner, and I looked to the right, and right down the next block there was a German tank in the middle of the street. And I thought, oh my God, that's why they were looking at me. The Germans have occupied Strasbourg, and I didn't know it. I would peer out every so often. Finally, the tank made its way across the next block where I couldn't see it anymore. I made a mad dash for the highway where, interestingly enough, our trucks, it was that close. Our trucks were still working. So I got on the truck and got back to camp. And here I had the near escape of where I could have been taken prisoner in Strasbourg. I managed to avoid that. When I got back to camp, the guys, some of the fellows who didn't know that I had been at the bakery said, "Where were you?" I said, "I was in Strasbourg." "Well, Colonel Zimmerman was looking for you. He wanted you to go on an IPW patrol, which meant interrogator prisoner of war. What he wanted to do is take me as an interpreter, pick up some German prisoners, and interrogate them to find out what the layout of the land was as far as the enemy lines." And since I was not available, he had to go without me. And the fellow said, "Boy, you're in trouble when he gets back." Well, the irony of it is that his Jeep was captured by the Germans. They were taken prisoner, and I avoided, once again on the same day, avoided being taken a prisoner by the Germans. Then not long after, it was my birthday. Now we were in a camp that had been part of a French cavalry regiment, and the commandant of the camp had a sign to him. There was a glass greenhouse with plants and everything in it, and we were eating our lunch in that glass greenhouse. Most of the fellas had had their lunch already. I had come in late because I had been on guard duty. And it was just myself and two other guys. These two other guys had been sent back. They had been shell-shocked. Psychologically, they weren't fit for combat anymore. So they were on their way back to a hospital. Anyhow, they were eating lunch with me, and all of a sudden, you could hear a shell coming in. Boom. And I came just a short distance away from that glass conservatory. Well, they got scared and they ran out with their mess kits and all, not even completing their lunch. And I thought, this is nonsense. The chances of a shell coming in are so remote. So I finished my lunch and I took it out, and about 30 or 40 feet away from the conservatory, we would dip our mess kits in barrels of hot steaming water to clean our mess kits. And I'm standing there, and as I'm standing there cleaning my mess kit, another shell comes in right in the glass greenhouse where I had been. What I realized later is that previous to the time we had been there, the Germans had occupied that area, and they knew it very well. So that was a target. And I just missed getting killed then. Well, it was my birthday. I figured, see, this is my birthday. It's my lucky day. It wasn't long after that we were heavily engaged in combat. Some of us were badly wounded. Others were taken prisoner. And there were days when we would march. We marched as much as 15, 20 miles in one day. It was sheer exhaustion, carrying our equipment, carrying our rifle. I remember one particular day when it rained so heavily. I was soaking wet. I was bitterly cold. I sat down and pulled off my boots to pour water out. The clothes acted like a wick into the boots. And the worst thing was, after I poured the water out, I had difficulty getting my boots back on over my wet socks. It was misery, sheer misery. I looked forward to combat at times because it gave me an opportunity to lie down and shoot rather than be marching. At any rate, it was a tough period. You know, there were times when I was marching, I was so exhausted and cold and miserable, and I just told myself, I can't get left behind. I have to put one foot ahead of the other, and I have to keep it up. With just willpower. Just, you will yourself, you have to continue. You can't. You just have to go. But the respite came towards dusk. When we came to any town, we would, and this was an unpleasant thing for me too. Since I spoke German, I was put in what they called a quartering party. I was told to go into the houses of these people and chase them out into their barns. And I hated that. Women and children are still women and children. I didn't care if they were German or who they were. They still were women and children, and I hated that idea of having to push them out of their house and send them into the barns. In Germany, the farmers kept together in a village. Their houses were in a village. Their barns were in the back. Their fields were outside the village. In other words, they didn't have a house and as we did, a farmhouse, and the houses were clustered together. So we would occupy the house. We would tell the people, mostly old people, women and children, and this could be a cold winter's night, to go in their barn while we took over their house. And I would go into the bed upstairs, a feather bed, just to be able to rest and sleep. But what was disconcerting, I could be sleeping in that feather bed for just 2 or 3 hours, and then about 3 or 4 in the morning, we would be told, up and out 'em, got to start marching again. Because the German army was in retreat and we couldn't let them regroup. So the idea was to keep pushing. I recall once we had reached the outskirts of a town in Germany. We had gone through the town, past the town, wooded area on the right, fields, furrowed fields, and all of a sudden machine gun fire from the wooded area. So we dropped. I thought to myself, I can't see the enemy. I see a flash every so often from one of their guns, but I can't see them. Who am I firing at? So I thought to myself, if I shoot, I'm going to end up having to clean my rifle. So I lay there in the field. I took I had an armed forces paperback book out of my pocket, and I started to read it. It was almost dusk. And I remember it was Thoreau's Walden that I had. I remember the book. But as I said, if I start firing, I'm going to have to clean the rifle, so why bother? We crossed 2 rivers. We crossed the Rhine at Würzburg, and here we suffered a number of casualties. The Germans were putting on stiff resistance at this point, and our engineers had made pontoon bridges where we were able to cross, because the Germans had destroyed bridges wherever they could. And the second river we crossed was the River Main at a city called Worms. Our Air Force, such as it was, in order to soften up the opposition, had bombed out a German artillery regiment which had been on the other side of the river. Things had gotten so bad, they had run out of fuel, so they were using horse-drawn artillery. Well, when we crossed, we found this whole field full of dead German soldiers and some horses that were still alive but on 3 legs. So our soldiers had to put the horses out of their misery. But there were dead soldiers, dead horses, and the stench was awful. And you never forget that. You never forget that smell, the smell of death. At any rate, it was only about a couple of weeks later that we came to the Munich area. Now, some of our troops were fighting in Munich, although there wasn't a lot of resistance. Munich wasn't that tough. It was April the 28th that we started combat in the Munich area. Dachau, the concentration camp, was only about 8 or 9 miles outside of Munich. So while some of our troops were engaged in Munich, taking over Munich, others of our troops were entering Dachau. This was April 29th. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We came in on trucks. We didn't know much about Dachau. You know, during the war, we knew we were fighting the Germans. We had heard stories, but we didn't know how credible they were about how bad. We knew that the Germans were killing Jews wherever they could, but we didn't know the extent of it. We had no idea. At any rate, the Germans referred to Dachau as the Konzentrationslager Dachau, concentration camp Dachau. And when you entered the camp, there was a big gate with a sign overhead, Arbeit macht frei, meaning work makes you free, work liberates you. Dachau wasn't set up as primarily a death camp, although it resulted in that. And they did have the crematoriums there to destroy bodies. It was really essentially set up as a work camp to help the German army. There was some munitions factories there. There were clothing factories. There was even a factory that made shoe shine polish, of all things. And they had an interesting factory that made beautiful objects made from porcelain, where the more talented or gifted prisoners would work. But by and large, most of the prisoners were half-starved. Many of them died while working in the factories. We had no idea until I actually saw the camp. I had heard vague stories about anti-Semitism and how Jews were getting killed, but I had no idea of the magnitude or what really was going on. I didn't know about Auschwitz or we didn't know about those things. Until we entered Dachau, that was the revelation to us of what actually was happening. When we first got into Dachau, Dachau had been run by the SS, one of the cruelest and worst elements of the German army. And there was fighting going on in the camp when we first came in. We were told that there were boxcars of dead people along the tracks. So we went over to see what was going on, and here you had these cattle cars of dead people. What had happened is they had been on these cattle cars, open cattle cars, crowded in without any food, no toilet facilities whatsoever. And they were on these cattle cars for about 3 weeks, and they died on them. You know, This is hard to describe psychologically. As I said, I had seen dead bodies, I'd seen dead soldiers. Nothing could prepare us for what we saw at Dachau. After the boxcars, we then went to where the crematorium was. This is what I saw in the crematorium. What would happen is those people who survived the boxcar trip and who obviously were too weak to work were taken over to the crematorium. And they were told, and you have to imagine these people coming off the boxcar, they're dirty. They had not bathed in weeks. They come into this building where they're told they can take a shower bath. The Germans didn't want to have to undress them after they were dead, so they asked them to remove their clothes because they were going to take a shower. The Germans wanted their clothes because they would be fumigated, laundered, and then reused. And this was an easy way to get the clothes without having to undress them. And there was a sign over this room which said Brausebad, which means shower bath. And they would be marched into the room to get their shower, and the doors would be slammed shut, and the gas would be turned on. And you know what happened. They were just thrown like a pile of wood. And their eyes were bulging, their tongues hanging out, and the smell, the stench was overpowering. It was one of the worst sights you could see. And you just couldn't imagine how people could do this to one another. Man's inhumanity to man. It was one of the worst things you could possibly encounter. In the camp itself, outside the hospital, there were so many people who died in the hospital. This picture on the right shows rows of dead bodies, naked dead bodies lying on the ground. Had the SS who ran the camp, if they had the fuel, they would have been burnt in the ovens. I'm missing a central portion of the story. When we came into the camp, we saw all the prisoners that had been released. And they wore these prison garb uniforms. They looked like almost like pajamas with vertical stripes. It's assumed that most of the prisoners were Jewish, but the reality was there were 30,000 people in that camp. Only about 3,200 were Jews. They were harder on the Jews than anybody else. They died quicker, and they didn't last. So this was another aspect. However, I was able to speak with some of them, some of the Jewish people, and when they heard that I was Jewish, they were delighted. An Amerikaner Jüdische Soldat, an American Jewish soldier, they were thrilled. They all wanted to leave the camp, but we could not let them leave. And we would tell them we would be followed by other aspects of the army who would feed them and clothe them and eventually take care of their needs, but we couldn't. We were only there temporarily. And it was better for them to stay where they were until the rest of the army, with their medical people and their other officials, arrived. Some of the prisoners were so delighted and so anxious to get out that they tried to climb the fence, but the fence was electrified, and a few of them died trying to get out over the electric fence. But as I said, our main mission there temporarily was to tell them to stay where they are. And another thing, some of our soldiers, well-meaning, gave them their K rations, and that was not a good idea because they were so emaciated and so thin, eating the K rations made them sick. On the first night I was there, I was assigned to one of the women's barracks. And that was a very sad experience in a way. Most of those women had been abused. A lot of them had been raped. These women were really, they were starved. And they had been without clothes, any decent clothes. They wore rags. So when we liberated the camp, they had access to the clothes that were around, and they were fighting each other foolishly for possession of dresses and so forth. At any rate, there was a young girl. She was around 17, slim, blonde, a pretty girl. And she was a natural leader. And the other women deferred to her. And at times, while we were chatting, one of the ladies in the barracks themselves, it was nighttime by then, would have a nightmare or start screaming. And so this young lady would go back and hush her and calm her down. And as I say, I was amazed because she couldn't have been more than 17 years old. And and it was really unusual to see how the other women looked up to her. An interesting thing, you know, when I look back in retrospect, I don't remember, I have a complete wipeout, complete blackout of how I spent the rest of that night. I know my shift was until 10 o'clock and I left there. I don't know where I slept, how I slept. All I know is that the next morning I was assigned to guard duty outside the crematorium. I have to add that the K rations that I mentioned before were about the size of a Cracker Jack box, a little bigger. And they had a tin of canned meat, sort of ground up meat. There was a little packet of orange powder for where you can make an orange drink for yourself. There was a coffee packet, there was a sugar packet, and there was a cream packet, all of which you can make your own coffee. In order to make your coffee, you would use your helmet, your steel helmet. And I was squatting outside the crematorium, outside the entrance, and I lit my Cracker Jack box, and I was using that, and I used the water from my canteen, mixing with the different powders to make coffee, and I was heating my coffee in my steel helmet, squatting there, and using the Cracker Jack box as my fire to heat it up. And two journalists came out of the building, out of the crematorium, obviously looking very upset, looking pale. And one of them said to me, "Were you in there? Did you see that?" And he was talking obviously about the dead bodies and the stench and the overwhelming sight that you saw when you went into that crematorium. And he said, "Did you see that?" And I said, "Yes, I was there yesterday." And he looked at me, he said, "How can you eat?" And he leaned up against the outside wall of the crematorium and he threw up. The shock effect at Dachau itself was such that you were just in a state of shock, and that's it. And you were numbed by it, and you couldn't do any more than that. You still have to eat. Life has to go on. I was so overwhelmed, It's you're in a state of shock, and you become numb, and because otherwise you would go crazy. After that session guarding the crematorium, we were back on trucks again, and we were trucked over to the Munich area, where we, by this time, the German army surrendered. They didn't surrender. They left Munich very readily, intending to put up a show of resistance further away. So we took Munich very easily. Only 9 days later, the war ended. We were pushing the Germans back, where it reached a point they didn't have fuel, they didn't have the weapons that they needed and so forth. They couldn't put up the resistance that they did earlier. So on May the 9th, they capitulated. There was a complete surrender. By this time, we had pushed them to the border of Austria. It was near the Austrian border. And this is where the eventual surrender took place. Of our generals met with their generals, and peace was declared. In my own case, what happened, you have to realize that after the war, when we were sent back, we wanted to forget Dachau. We didn't want to even think about all the terrible sights we saw. And so we collectively, the soldiers, we went to school on the GI Bill. We got jobs, we got married, we had children, we had families, and all this was submerged. It was forgotten for a while. Not forgotten, but we didn't want to think about it. It wasn't until about 20, 30 years later when you started to hear about these Holocaust deniers who claimed it never happened. That's when we started to bring back our memories and started to tell about what we saw. And when this book was written, Dachau 29, the soldiers who had been with me were now in their 70s. Of course, this is 20 years later, And I, for many years, did not want to talk about it, did not want to think about it. It was just too unpleasant, So we buried our memories. And at times, when I try to remember certain things, there's a blackout. I can't. I want to remember, and I can't. I went to Temple on the GI Bill. I was a communications major, or at that time it was radio speech theater. Eventually, I had hoped to get into television. The first job I got after leaving Temple was at WCAU Channel 10 as a news writer. And so after a year and a half, I decided that I have to look elsewhere. I took the civil service examinations, and fortunately, I got a very high score. And there were 2 jobs open at the Marine Corps in personnel administration. One was wage and salary, and the other was employee relations. So I chose employee relations. I felt that I would rather be dealing with people than with numbers all the time. The Marine Corps, my first job, I met a very nice young lady who I became engaged to and got married. And we had 2 children, Alan and Marcia. I'm privileged to have survived. I'm very fortunate. I was just a very lucky person to have been able to get through what I saw and the combat experiences I was in. I saw friends of mine who never made it. I've just been very, very, very fortunate. And I'm thankful I'm here today to tell you about it. I don't know why or how I'm still here, but I am, and I'm thankful for it. I live from day to day and make the best of it.